Welcome to a crash course in guns in America from a medical sociological perspective with your host, Dr. Benjamin Dowd-Arrow. There are a lot of guns in the United States, roughly 500 million in the hands of civilians. For context, about 1 in 4 Americans own a gun, and about 43% of American households own a gun. And about 29% of gun owners own 5 or more guns. Historically, gun owners have been white, middle-aged, middle-class, conservative men. But research is showing that those demographics are changing. Research has shown that younger men, as well as those experiencing financial instability or religious change, are buying guns at higher rates. And since the election of Donald Trump, other groups who are in marginalized statuses have been buying guns at higher rates as well. This includes the Black community and the LGBTQIA+ community. But it's still primarily a white Christian male phenomenon. Evangelicals own guns at higher rates than other groups, and they carry those guns at higher rates than other groups do. In fact, conservative Christians believe that they need more guns in more places so that they can fight off a vast supernatural evil. But the research shows over and over that more guns does not equal less crime. In fact, it shows quite the opposite, that the more guns in a state, the more crime is in that state. And despite claims by the NRA that it's about self-defense and stopping crime, less than 1% of crime is ever stopped by a civilian with a firearm who did not use a gun as part of their job, like a member of law enforcement or the military. In fact, when we look at the data on guns and crime, gun homicides are actually higher in states that have looser laws than states that have stricter ones. And the data shows this over and over. You can see that the best states are states like New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Hawaii, California, and the worst states are Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and so on and so forth. In fact, Mississippi is the worst state in the U.S., and it is about 6 times as bad as New York. If we look at just gun homicides, Jackson, Mississippi has a rate of 99.5 per 100,000. Chicago is 14.9 per 100,000. Los Angeles was 4.7 per 100,000. And the city, New York, has a rate of 2 per 100,000, making it one of the safest cities in the United States. But where does Tallahassee fit in on all this? Tallahassee has a gun homicide rate of 8.9 per 100,000, meaning it's better than Chicago, but nowhere near as good as Los Angeles or New York City. And while guns may not stop crime, it actually can increase the risk to people in the home. Having a gun in the home increases the risk of a domestic violence homicide to women by 5 times. In fact, more than 70 women are killed every month by a partner with a gun. 77% of the victims of intimate partner homicide are women. And when we look at the women who are killed with guns in comparable nations, we find that 92% of all women killed with guns in high-income countries are from the United States. But women aren't the only ones at risk. For the 3rd straight year in a row, firearms are the leading cause of death for children aged 1 to 17, and firearm mortality has increased 106% for this age group since 2013. In 2022, there were 2,526 gun deaths among kids aged 1 to 17. This works out to be about 7 a day. And for 15 to 17-year-olds, well, firearms account for 1/3 of all deaths in that age group. And one of the biggest reasons that this rate is so high involves responsible gun ownership, or rather the lack of it. See, all too often kids find firearms that have been left unattended or unsecured. And kids have found firearms in all kinds of places, like bathrooms or bedrooms or cars, or, hell, some kids have even found firearms just laying on the sidewalk. And unfortunately, these types of stories don't usually have happy endings. And consider how many minors that perpetuate mass shootings got their firearms from their house because the weapons were not secured. So yeah, gun mortality continues to rise for kids ages 1 to 17. And part of this is directly related to the lobbying efforts of groups like the National Rifle Association. See, one of the reasons that motor vehicle deaths keep dropping for this demographic is that we require some pretty serious safety features, some of which the automotive industry implemented all on their own. So, for example, one of the regulations that has been shown to reduce child mortality in vehicles is requiring car seats and booster seats, as well as seat belts. But we don't see these kinds of regulations for the gun industry because the NRA fights to prevent the government from requiring them. And look, I know that passing things like safe storage laws won't reduce all of the mortality that we see among children, but that's really not the purpose of law. The purpose of law is to reduce the amount of times certain behaviors happen in society, not to reduce all instances of that behavior. If that was the goal that we set, we would not have any laws at all. But now I'm going to paraphrase Ronald Reagan for a moment. We know putting these regulations in place will not bring child mortality to zero, but research has shown it will bring it down enough to make it worthwhile. But that's not the only threat to children when it comes to firearms. In light of recent events, there are a lot of people who are making the argument that we just need to harden our schools if we want to keep kids safe. And I get it, on the surface, that sounds like it would be a good idea. After all, having more armed security in schools should keep children safer. And more importantly, it should make the children feel like they are safer. And we think this because most of us just envision the armed security guard running into danger to save children's lives. But sadly, too many of these armed security guards, whether they're law enforcement, former military, or just a civilian, run away from danger rather than towards it. They're like, oh, he's got an AR-15? Nah, peace out, I'm good. And then those teachers and children are left to deal with the bad guy by themselves. And the clearest case of this is in Uvalde, Texas, where 376 officers stood by while one person held them off with an AR-15. But Dr. Dowd-Arrow, isn't that just anecdotal evidence? What does the actual research say about armed security in schools? Well, it's not good. In a recent study that looked at events that happened at schools between 1980 and 2019, they found the presence of armed guards actually increased the odds of teachers or children being hurt or unalived in those events. And it was a pretty significant uptick. For every armed guard, the odds of someone being hurt was increased by 2.83 times. Which means increasing armed security can have some very serious consequences for everyone involved. Consequences like fewer people getting to come home at the end of the day. So yeah, the data does not support the idea that armed guards make us safer. Okay, so if not armed guards, then can't we do something else? Because lately we hear a lot of people saying that in order to keep kids safe, that we're going to need to harden our schools. And a lot of people think that the best way to do that is to put firearms in the hands of teachers. Because honestly, who's better for protecting kids than the untrained civilian employees of a school? Besides, we already know that law enforcement and armed security for schools are more concerned about making it home safely themselves than they are in stopping these events. So they just end up standing around and watching it all burn down rather than doing anything to put out the fire. And we know this because of Uvalde, where we have the body cam footage and audio from the 376 officers who just stood around that day. So yeah, obviously, it only makes sense then, since we can't depend on armed security to keep kids safe, it falls on the teachers to be the ones responsible for that. Because we know those teachers will be super responsible and never leave the firearms in a place where kids can just randomly find them, like outside, or in a school bathroom, or classroom, or any other place on the school's campus. And besides, if they did find them in one of those places because the teacher accidentally just left it laying around, they certainly wouldn't play with them. They know better. So yeah, it makes sense to arm the teachers. Teachers who are woefully underfunded for their jobs. I mean, it's not like 95% of teachers in the United States have to spend their own money on school supplies and they aren't reimbursed for it. Right? Nearly 80% of teachers oppose being armed, and 54% say being armed would make kids less safe. In fact, it's often the male faculty of these schools, like the football coaches and things, who say they do want to be armed. And in my own research, I had someone tell me that they could stop one of these events because, like Keanu Reeves in The Matrix, he knew Kung Fu. Seriously, I don't know why I'm surprised when nearly half of men believe that during an emergency situation, yeah, they could fly an airplane and land it, no problem. And this doesn't even address the fact that so many conservatives don't trust teachers to begin with. Politicians like Donald Trump have accused teachers of indoctrinating students. And in some states, like in Florida, teachers aren't even allowed to pick their curriculum or choose what books are in their classroom. But you're going to trust them with a firearm. Yeah, okay. And I've already mentioned how teachers are not reimbursed for all of the school supplies and things that they have to buy out of pocket each year, which means that teachers are reduced to begging people to help fund their classrooms. So who is going to pay for the training and the firearms that they would need? The median starting salary for a teacher is only around $44,000, which means when we adjust for inflation, they're making about 5% less than they did 10 years ago. And this doesn't even get into the fact that most of the people who commit these heinous acts are former students. And you can't convince me that there is a single teacher out there who would not hesitate when that event arises. Because it's just human nature. You have a relationship with these people. You see them every day. You can't imagine that someone you have a relationship with you is going to be the person who harms you. So yeah, arming teachers is not a solution. And we have evidence that it's not a real solution when we consider that states like Texas allow teachers to be armed, and that hasn't deterred any of these events nor prevented people from losing their lives. Now, Dr. Dowd-Arrow, we've talked about homicides and mass shootings, but we haven't talked about the number one cause of gun mortality in the United States, which is suicides. Well, before we get into that, I want to tell you two stories. And both of the stories I'm about to tell you are taken from Michael Onestis' book, Guns and Suicide, An American Epidemic. First, I want to introduce you to Charlie. Charlie is a professor at a research institution in the natural sciences field. Now, Charlie is a well-respected scientist, having published numerous papers in his field. He's also extremely involved in his department. He helps out as much as he can, he volunteers for things, and he loves working with students. In fact, he mentors as many students as he can. He's always the first person to arrive and the last to leave for events or when he's teaching classes. So when he doesn't show up to teach a class for graduate students, immediately red flags are raised. After all, this is completely unlike him, so his colleagues decide to go out and check his house to see if he's okay. When they get to his house, they see his car is still there, and they go up to the door and knock, and no one answers. When they try the doors, they find that the doors are locked, so they go around the house and find a back door window that they're able to come into. Now, this window lets in a hallway right by the bathroom, and that's the first room that they go into, where they find that Charlie has turned a gun on himself in the shower. Charlie had been dealing with depression the entire year leading up to the event, and he had hoped that he could make it through the semester before he took his life, but that was not the case. He had meticulously planned this out, though. He had hoped that his maid, who was set to arrive in just an hour, would find him first, so he had left a note for her to not go in that bathroom and to call the police. He hadn't counted on his colleagues showing up and breaking into his house and finding him before the maid arrived. But the warning signs were all there. Charlie was a single white man, and he was a person who did not believe in mental health services, and he was clinically depressed. He also gave out a lot of warning signs for those who would be listening. He would tell his colleagues cryptic little things like, if something were to happen to me, tell my son I love him. Now let's meet Hector. Hector is a young man in the United States Army, and he seems happy on the surface. But Hector grew up in a household where he was criticized for being less than perfect. His family would make fun of his every mistake, and so that made him want to be a perfectionist. It also meant that he wouldn't take chances or risk anything that could lead to ridicule. Now, Hector was a member of the Honor Guard. For those that don't know, the Honor Guard are those that perform at funerals in the military. And Hector took his job very, very seriously. So this means that Hector would be the kind of guy that at a military ball, he would just stand off by himself by the punch bowl and not dance, because dancing can lead to ridicule. But despite his fears and anxiety of being less than perfect, he does manage to fall in love and get married. Now, Hector was due some leave, and he had never taken any, and so he finally puts in to take some to go on vacation with his wife to her family. And she is very anxious about this, because she too grew up in a household where she was criticized for being less than perfect, so she was very anxious about being around her family. But the morning that they were supposed to leave, Hector got news that his leave was canceled canceled because he needed to perform at a funeral. Now, had he known, he could have requested to still go because he hadn't taken any leave, but he did not want to disappoint his commanding officers, and so he told his wife he can't go. This infuriates her, and she begins to call him names and say all the horrible things that he already believed about himself. So she leaves to go meet with the family, and while driving there, she FaceTimes him and watches as he takes a gun out of his closet and begins to meticulously clean it. And as he takes that gun, he takes it and he points it at himself under his chin. And just as he is about to pull the trigger, with his wife screaming at him on the phone to stop, his dog comes up and licks his face. And that brings him out of his moment when he realizes that if something can love him so unconditionally like this dog, that maybe there was a reason to put the gun down. And so Hector got into therapy. But Hector had a job that routinized death, and he came from a family background that put too much pressure on him to be perfect. This all led to this mental break where he thought that he was not good enough to continue living, especially after his wife said all the things that he already believed to be true about himself. But luckily for Hector, he was able to get the mental health services that he needed to work through all of the things that he had been feeling. 62% of gun deaths in the United States are suicides, and most white men are like Charlie in that they do not trust mental health services, so they do not seek it out. And I say this from experience, as I am a survivor. While women make up the bulk of suicide attempts, men make up the bulk of suicide completions. And this has a lot to do with the method chosen. Overwhelmingly, men choose a firearm for suicide. While only about 15% of all other methods will be fatal, only about 5% of people who use a gun for suicide will survive. And 80% of gun deaths among white men are suicides. But white men aren't the only ones at risk. Members of the LGBTQIA+ community also have high rates of suicide. And we're seeing suicide rates climb among people of color, specifically black men. In fact, we're actually seeing a reversal of trends in suicide. In 2023, suicides made up only about 55% of gun deaths in the United States. However, as I mentioned, it's now 62% as the most recent data. Now, Dr. Dowd-Arrow, since we know now that guns cause more crime and higher rates of gun mortality of all kinds, suicides, mass shootings, homicides, all higher in states with looser laws, surely we can use that and do something about it. Well, meet Jay Dickey, an Arkansas representative who back in 1996 wrote something that will come to be called the Dickey Amendment. The Dickey Amendment was a direct reaction to a paper published in 1993 by Arthur Kellerman. In this paper, he showed that children living in homes with guns had higher rates of mortality and injury. Jay Dickey was afraid that liberal scientists were going to take away the right to bear arms, and that's why he passed this amendment. The Dickey Amendment said that if the CDC funded any research that promoted gun control, they would lose 100% of their funding. And in 2012, this was expanded to the National Institutes of Health. And what the Dickey Amendment meant by promoting gun control was completely up to arbitrary interpretation. The CDC could fund someone like myself to do research on guns in America, and then someone else could take my paper to Congress and argue that I was promoting gun control. The Dickey Amendment was considered a moratorium on gun research, and the CDC and NIH have basically refused to fund it until recent years, and only very limited grants have been made available, and most of that looking at it from the angle of mental health. As someone who is a firm believer in science, I'm also a firm believer that we should be using that research to help guide our policy making. So as long as the Dickey Amendment is in place, we can't use research to guide decisions towards guns in America. Researchers need to be funded so that we can understand the risks that guns bring, as well as understanding the things that could limit those risks or reduce them entirely. And while we have tried to repeal the Dickey Amendment numerous times since it was passed in 1996 as part of an omnibus spending rider, we have been unable to actually do so. The best we got was in 2017 when Alex Azar changed it to say that the CDC is not prevented from studying guns from a mental health perspective. So this has been your crash course into guns in America from a medical sociology perspective.